Thank you very much. That's a real privilege to be here. Yeah, so can you see my slides okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you about a piece of research which I'm currently doing as part of a kind of, well, it is a research project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship, which is kind of loosely building on my PhD research, or connected to it. Yeah, so perhaps I can get onto that in due course. Must remember to press my stopwatch as well, so I don't go on for too long. Yeah, so essentially, I'm looking at it's a 3-year project, and I'm looking at what are the connections between gender and climate change, and especially when it comes to like violence, because that's what my research has been focused on previously, basically. And I was interested in thinking about that in relation to the climate crisis, which is obviously something which is going to, which is just a huge issue, which is already, and it is just going to affect all of our lives more and more, and actually has lots of overlaps, I think, with issues of violence and gender-based violence, which are perhaps not being talked about enough, actually. Yeah, so I think it's increasingly being understood, I guess, that actually the climate crisis is something which is very gendered in lots of different ways. So first of all, I suppose there's a growing body of research kind of illustrating how the climate crisis will and is already exacerbating like unequal gendered power relations in society in lots of different ways. And actually, I suppose one of the things I'm going to focus on as well is how we can actually see that it's being driven by these inequalities as well, actually. But yeah, so there's quite a lot of different, pieces of research showing that, in lots of different natural disasters, obviously kind of natural in quotation marks, because obviously these things are actually being certainly hastened, if not, outright being caused by human activities. So we can't really just see them as being natural. Or inevitable necessarily. But yeah, lots of different natural disasters, which the climate crisis is kind of is contributing to. Women seem to be often disproportionately impacted by these things. And obviously that varies a lot from setting to setting and the kind of impacts that has and how it plays out. Of course, these things are always complex and context dependent. But some of the reasons for that, well, it comes back to gender inequality, basically, that if women have fewer resources in the first place, or if they've got greater caring responsibilities, for example, that can make it a lot harder to kind of deal with the consequences of a natural disaster. It can make it harder to escape. Like if you're in a situation where there's flooding, for example, women may feel like a greater responsibility to stay behind, to care for relatives or children and things like that, or that might like slow down their ability to get out of that situation. I mean, we can also see in countries where there's been a lot of flooding, for example, often more women die because perhaps women and girls are not taught to swim, as often as men and boys are taught to, for example. And we can also see in a lot of contexts like women's livelihoods are worse affected as well, because in lots of countries, I suppose women might be doing work which is more dependent on like natural resources, like things like agriculture, collecting water, things like that. So yeah, women's in lots of contexts, women's economic position is worse impacted as well. And I suppose, yeah, the consequences of that is that makes gender inequality worse. So yeah, the climate crisis is both is making worse and is it's making gender inequality worse, essentially, as well as that playing out in the consequences of climate change itself. But this isn't really something which is being talked about that much at the policy level, and that's something I'll discuss a bit more shortly. But yeah, another way, I suppose, in which we can see that climate change is having a disproportionate impact on women and girls is in terms of violence. So again, there's kind of growing evidence in different contexts that climate breakdown may be kind of exacerbating different forms of violence against women and girls. So, for example, if we think about domestic abuse, there's research in different countries, for example, like Australia, after things like the bushfires which happened there, which obviously climate change is contributing to and making worse, things like domestic abuse often seem to get worse in the wake of these kinds of crises, like the abuse might increase, women might become more entrapped, or new cases of domestic abuse may arise, lots of different settings. Yeah, and I'll explore in the next slide like why that might be, I guess. But I suppose we can also think about the COVID situation, right? Obviously, COVID is a bit different, but a similar crisis situation where we saw domestic abuse being exacerbated, I guess. Also, things like sexual violence and sexual exploitation. In these kind of crisis situations, we can see that, that creates situations where maybe it's easier to perpetrate sexual violence. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, there are a lot of cases of sexual violence there, like, when lots of people were just stuck in that huge sports stadium and things like that. And some people, men in particular, may seek to kind of exploit these crisis situations. And, we know that like refugees can often be quite vulnerable to like human trafficking, for example. I mean, we can see, with the war in Ukraine, how like women and children, in some cases, there have been efforts to like exploit and, traffic or, kind of sexually exploit women and children in those kind of contexts, which obviously, again, the climate crisis is exacerbating these kind of refugee situations, increasing the number of refugees significantly. So this is kind of a quite emerging but growing area of research in terms of how in the wake of different disasters or during different disasters, violence against women and girls can be kind of exacerbated. And so, why might that be, I guess? I mean, first and foremost, I think we can see that the climate crisis is creating or exacerbating the kinds of social conditions which allow violence and abuse to thrive, right? I mean, there's even research which shows that like just as the climate warms, that seems to increase violence of all kinds of violence in different settings, for example. But also in a more social way, I think, as well. We can see that. But yeah, perhaps it might be tempting to just say that this is just because like people are more stressed, there's more anxiety, and therefore that just leads to more violence. I mean, of course that may be like a factor, but I think maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that as well. And I suppose we can't just blame disasters or blame climate change for this violence because it's humans which are enacting this violence, right? That is a choice. And obviously we don't see women and girls perpetrating violence to anywhere near the same extent in these disaster situations. So that must mean, therefore, there's something going on with men, there's something going on with masculinity, which means that, some men are potentially engaging in more acts of violence and abuse in these situations. Why might that be? Well, first of all, we can see that disasters shake up social norms, I guess. So perhaps violence can be a kind of response to that, a kind of defensive or backlash response to that, perhaps. Because of that increased anxiety and things about changes which might be happening in society. I mean, I suppose for all of us, right? And again, COVID demonstrates a good example of this. Like in these kind of crisis or disaster situations, there's a real loss of control over our lives, right? And that's terrifying and scary and really difficult for any of us to deal with. But I suppose, if there are all these expectations and norms out there in society which expect men to be in control, to have control over their own lives, over the other people in their lives, especially women and children, but they feel like that control might be being lost, then I suppose for some men, perhaps violence and abuse can offer a way of trying to reassert or regain control, perhaps. I think we can see this is very much tied in with masculinity and how men respond to these crisis situations. And again, as I've said, they also just provide sometimes more opportunities to perpetrate abuse as well, whether that's because of there being lots of refugees or in the case of COVID, because we're all stuck at home all the time, things like that. So I suppose often we can see that natural disasters can present more opportunities for this kind of thing as well. Another issue which is perhaps not talked about quite as much in this regard as well is if we think about like how we respond to environmental activists who are often subjected to violence and abuse in different countries, including here in the UK, I guess, right? We can see in recent years that there has been increased punitive responses to environmental activists from the police, from the government, which in some cases can be quite violent. And I suppose, sometimes that the treatment of environmental activists, the treatment of women activists can be quite, that sexual violence can be an element of that often, I think, right, in how women protesters might be treated. I mean, we can see that, women environmental activists, if we think about Greta Thunberg as the kind of perhaps the most well-known example, the kind of misogyny, right, and sexism, which a lot of men seem to express in response to her, right? That she's this young, outspoken woman, and perhaps some men, like your Donald Trumps of the world and so on, seem to find that difficult to deal with. So there's a kind of misogynistic element to the response that women environmental activists in particular get. But also, yeah, I mean, this violence is often being enacted by state or corporate actors as well, isn't it? If we think about the kind of the spy cops scandal here in the UK, right, that you had police officers undercover engaging in relationships with female protesters over massive periods of time, sometimes having children and things like that, essentially sexual violence, because how could that be a consensual relationship? So having a hugely devastating impact on these women who were from a whole range of different organizations, but several of whom were environmental activists. And also, yeah, cases of killings of environmental activists have increased in recent years as well, many of whom, again, women. So, yeah, it's another interesting example, I suppose, of how humans are being impacted in relation to climate change and how that connects to violence. And, yeah, I suppose I'm interested in, are there overlaps there with, different kinds of backlash? So the kind of backlash which might be expressed to environmental activists, is that coming from perhaps some of the same groups expressing a backlash to feminism, other movements for equality and social justice, and why might that be? Yeah, I'll explore that a bit more later. But yeah, so I suppose for me, somebody who researches men and masculinities, I guess I'm interested in, well, where are men in all of this, right? Yeah, what different roles are men playing? What role could we play? Because obviously this violence is coming from somewhere, and most of the violence I'm talking about is being perpetrated by men. But yeah, I suppose if we look at a kind of bigger picture for a moment, in terms of who's in charge of society, who has power, who's presiding over the kind of Anthropocene that we're now living in, it is predominantly men, right? I mean, I'm sure many of you will have seen this picture from COP26 here in Glasgow, the climate change conference, of all the world leaders making decisions at this vital conference, overwhelmingly men. And the graph just shows as well, how not just the actual world leaders, but the kind of delegations which are sent to these vital climate change conferences are very much dominated by men. It has grown over time, but I think, most recently in the graph, 2014, women are still, around 25% of the delegations. Yeah, and if we look at, who's in charge of businesses, women are still only 15% of Fortune 500 CEOs, only 22% of government ministers are women currently, only 15% of environment ministers. So yeah, these are just a few examples of who's making the decisions, who's leading us into this situation with the climate crisis where we don't seem to be able to turn things around. It is predominantly men. Yeah, and also I suppose we can look more broadly as well about differences in behavior and things like that, differences in attitudes to the climate crisis. I mean, first of all, men are more likely to work in a lot of the kind of extractive, environmentally destructive industries connected to climate change. So, for example, the oil and gas industry themselves have found that 78% of oil and gas workers internationally are men. Men also, obviously, these are huge generalizations, but on average, men do tend to have bigger carbon footprints than women. And the graph on the right just illustrates some of the differences there in a piece of research which was done mainly in the Nordic countries about different aspects of that. And I think a lot of that, again, comes back to gender inequality, really, that if men have got more economic resources in the first place, then that means you're probably going to be consuming more as well, right? But perhaps it also does come back to how we define what it means to be a man, what's seen as being desirable behaviors for men to engage in. And actually lots of those things, I think you could see how actually that's connected to the treatment of the environment, right? If we think about things like eating meat, things like driving cars, like fast cars, gas guzzling cars, things like flying, these are all seen as quite desirably masculine practices, right? And all of them do have a detrimental impact on the environment. And so, yeah, in the United States, Kara Daggett has done research around how, for a lot of men, their identities are very much wrapped up in the consumption of fossil fuels. And so she's called that petromasculinity and talked about how that's been used by politicians like Donald Trump as a way of like appealing to men in response to things like the environmental movement. Yeah. Meanwhile, like women tend to, again, huge generalizations, but on average, women tend to express more knowledge about climate change. They're more likely to see it as being a kind of serious threat and to worry about its consequences. They're also seemingly more likely to like change their behavior as well in response to climate change. So I suppose, yeah, does that suggest that actually acting for the environment, like trying to care for the environment, engaging in like environmentally friendly behaviors, are those sometimes seen as being unmanly, and that somehow it's not cool or okay or desirable for men to engage in those things? Yeah, so the picture on the right just illustrates, this insult of like soy boy, that somehow, you're not a real man if you're not eating meat, or that if you're a vegetarian or vegan, yeah, then that's not a very kind of manly thing to do somehow. Just as one example, I guess. Yeah, and I think we can look at the bigger picture here. And I think there's, this all comes from like insights from kind of eco-feminist research and theorizing over the last few decades about, I suppose, yeah, if we think about what are the kinds of norms and values in society which might be shaping climate change, right, and shaping our relationship with nature. And I suppose you can think about like capitalism and, yeah, industrial capitalism, as being at the heart of this, but actually perhaps we need to think about how that does connect to gender as well, and like patriarchy and things like that. Because, yeah, I think, if we think about things like how, I suppose, our societies, there's this idea that we should be kind of constantly seeking more and more growth and expansion. There's this idea that it's desirable to like conquer our surroundings, our environment, to dominate over our environment, to like exploit resources as much as we possibly can, like natural resources. The idea that we somehow are entitled to use nature for, in whatever way we want to, or that we have some kind of ownership over nature and the land. The idea that, we as humans should be rational and detached from other living things, including nature and the environment and other animals, that we are somehow above nature. I think a lot of these things actually you can tie in with masculinity, right? And ideas about being a man, and how those shape our society as a whole, right? And how our society is run and organized. So yeah, I suppose if we're thinking about capitalism, if we're thinking about colonialism, these are also quite masculinist things in lots of ways. And so, yeah, so Martin Hultman and Paul Poulet have written a great book on this, and they talk about how like industrial breadwinner masculinity, which has been so at the core of like industrial capitalism, how that's a kind of a form of like masculine identity, which is really tied in with some of these ideas, and which, because lots of men's identities are so wrapped up in that can make it quite difficult to embrace change and shifts away from these kinds of thick ways of thinking and ways of behaving, I guess. Yeah. And so, yeah, for me, thinking about it from the perspective of like violence, I guess I'm quite interested in the overlaps here, right? Because I think a lot of the things which I said on the previous slide, you can see connecting with things like violence against women and other kinds of violence and abuse as well, right? So I suppose, yeah, like perhaps can we actually see like environmental harm, environmental destruction as itself being a kind of violence which has a lot of connections with other kinds of violence, predominantly by men in society, right? And how often these different kinds of violence actually share common roots in terms of being about fundamentally like the exertion of power and control, whether that's over other people or over the environment, or even over oneself, in terms of like self-destructive behaviors. And so, yeah, I suppose there's this idea, talked about by Michael Kaufman back in the 80s, this idea of like the triad of men's violence and how different kinds of men's violence can be like mutually reinforcing as well. So that goes back to what I was saying, that perhaps climate change creates conditions which allow violence to flourish. Yeah, so maybe if we mistreat the environment, then that also makes it easier to mistreat other humans. Yeah, in quite gendered ways. And of course, it works slightly differently here. Like obviously the environment isn't the same as like other humans. We can't quite equate these things, but at the same time, like, somebody like Galton has talked about how there's not just direct violence, like interpersonal violence. We've also got like structural violence, where like organizations or whole societies and social structures, are quite violent. whether that is towards other people or to our kind of environment, for example, and how that's legitimized by kind of cultural violence. So the ideas we have in our culture, which might perpetuate or kind of encourage types of violence, for example. Yeah, and so in terms of climate change, I mean, perhaps it's easier to see that in some ways with some things like burning down a forest. You know, that's quite obviously a kind of violence in a way, right? That you're killing all those trees and potentially all the kind of animals living in that forest. But also something like climate change, which is perhaps more kind of invisible and gradual and slow and difficult to like pin down to individual actors. Perhaps we can still see that as a kind of violence. So like Rob Nixon has talked about how you could see climate change as kind of slow violence, right? That it is gradual and invisible, but it's having these devastating long-term effects on like whole communities, and often communities who have the least power are being the ones who are the worst impacted as well, right? Yeah, and so I think another example we can see about how these things are connected is if we think about war, right, and militarism in society, and the kind of what's talked about as kind of treadmills of destruction, right, where there's this idea that we just constantly need to expand our militaries, which are obviously very violent and very kind of masculinized entities, which are also have a huge impact on the environment. I mean, militaries have massive carbon footprints, which often aren't even considered, you know, in equations about like the carbon footprint of countries and things like that. Yeah, and if we look at like the war in Ukraine currently, for example, you can see the destruction that war has, not just to other humans, but also to the environment, to other animals. And I mean, I suppose a famous example of this is you know, in the Vietnam War, about how the United States used like Agent Orange to just devastate whole forests in order to try to, you know, basically harm the kind of local populations and stuff like that. Yeah, so I suppose it's interesting to think about the overlaps and interconnections between violence against other people and violence against the environment, and how often that is quite a masculinized you know, kinds of practices, I guess. Yeah, but at the same time, I suppose it is important as well to be careful not to be like too essentialistic here. You know, like just equating, like if we're talking about violence against women, like equating women with nature or with the planet, for example. Yeah, because clearly these are different things, but at the same time, yeah, it's interesting to think about the links between different kinds of violence, I guess. And also not to think that somehow this violence is like inherent to men either, right? Because of course, men are not a homogenous monolithic group, right? There's huge variety, there's huge inequality among men. And men are engaging in lots of different ways with the environment, as I'll discuss a little bit later. And of course, as well, lots of the things I'm talking about have hugely detrimental impacts on men and boys ourselves as well, right? They have huge impacts on all of us. You know, men can often also be seen as like victims of like climate breakdown, as well as women and girls and all people. But yeah, if you think about like fire services, for example, and how that can often be quite a traumatic, if not dangerous job in the situations of like climate breakdown and stuff, which is quite obviously a male-dominated profession still. Also think about things like prisons, like during heat waves and things like that. There isn't really much consideration as those are increasing about, you know, how inhospitable many of our prisons are when the weather is getting increasingly hot. And yeah, I suppose these kinds of like disasters created by the climate crisis cause a huge amount of trauma and loss and like long-term physical and mental health issues as well for people. And perhaps, you know, men might find those things particularly difficult to talk about in a society where we're not really encouraged to ask for help or to express these difficult kinds of emotions with each other. And so again, like in the wake of disasters in places like Australia with like the bushfires, there's research about how, you know, lots of men there's been things like increases in substance abuse and increases in suicide in the wake of these disasters, especially in occupations like the fire service and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of issues here to do with masculinity, which are quite interesting and important, I think, to think about. And yeah, perhaps I suppose, obviously the climate crisis creates a lot of anxiety, right, among all of us, and that it reveals how, you know, vulnerable we all are as humans, how fragile we are, and perhaps men in particular might find that quite difficult to accept or like come to terms with or adapt to, because yeah, we're not supposed to associate these kinds of things with masculinity, I guess, right? Yeah. So yeah, I suppose perhaps we could see that actually in lots of ways climate change might pose a threat to lots of men's kind of masculine identities, and perhaps that's partly why we do see, men being quite, things like the climate change denial groups being quite dominated by men, for example. But yeah, and I suppose also if we think about how we're responding to the climate crisis, societies like Sherilyn McGregor has talked about how that's quite masculinized. So for example, if we who do we see as like possessing the solutions to the climate crisis? I guess we immediately think of science and technology, right? Which are of course like hugely important. I'm certainly not denying that, but these are quite male dominated sectors, right? And there's perhaps less attention to sectors of society, like education and healthcare and things like that, which are hugely important as well, but which are more dominated by women, and actually which already have low carbon footprints, but are not really being considered in like economic responses, like Green New Deals and things like that. And meanwhile, I guess the voices of people who are being most affected by climate change and who might already have lots of good solutions, like, people living in country in the global south, indigenous communities, they're often not having their voices heard very much in things like these climate change conferences and stuff like that. So perhaps we can see some of the issues I've been pointing to also there in how we're responding to the climate crisis, which is perhaps partly why our responses have been quite lackluster up till now. Yeah, so in terms of like the research I'm doing on this, I'm doing 3 kind of different parts. So I'm currently, I've almost finished speaking to like environmental activists here in the UK. I've done 26 interviews so far with them because I'm quite interested in like, how are people dealing with this in positive ways? How are people trying to find different ways of relating to the environment, and how are they navigating these kinds of gender norms and expectations? Like, are they challenging those norms, or are they potentially still reproducing them in some ways? And yeah, in addition to that, I'm also going to be doing some interviews with men in positions of power to see kind of what's going on with them in terms of like masculinity and stuff. And lastly, doing some focus groups with like young men about how are young men thinking about these issues? Are they actually coming up with different ways of being a man in response to these kind of crises which they're facing in their lives? But yeah, I'll just talk for a few minutes about the interviews with the environmental activists, because that's the only thing I've done so far. Yeah, and so that's quite interesting, I guess, because from the people I've spoken to, it seems like for many of them, they did grow up to some extent not conforming to like wider social norms, because of things like having a generalized commitment to social justice, but also perhaps, deviating in some way from like dominant gender norms, and that perhaps that gave them space to develop a different kind of relationship with the environment, because often they did have quite a important attachment to nature, which played a huge role in leading them to become involved in this kind of activism. Although that wasn't always the case. Like for some of the people I spoke to, it was specifically the climate crisis which led them to become activists in this area. And actually, interestingly, it was often children and young people who motivated them to do that, because they had children or other family members, and that they wanted to do something for them, right, for the next generation. And so I suppose it's interesting how that's gendered, I guess, right, because perhaps especially that's an important thing among mothers, and we see these groups of like mothers organizing, or even like grandmothers and things like that organizing about the climate crisis, but we don't see the same level of organizing going on among fathers and men in those kind of ways, which is perhaps an area where there could be space for more action, perhaps. Yeah, and actually, some of my findings very much connect to like what Raewyn Connell found in research she did like 30 years ago with environmental activists, where she found that for lots of men in this space, there was a kind of remaking of the self, like a remaking of masculinity, which was going on, by virtue of being involved in environmental activism, that it forced people to, they weren't just campaigning to, on green issues. It was actually leading to quite a deep reevaluation of oneself, I guess, and one's place in society, which is quite interesting when it comes to gender, I guess. Yeah, so this is just a quote from one of my participants. He said, so I've got 3 older brothers, and when compared with them, I'm like the sensitive one. I'm like the one who's always sort of been quite emotive and always sort of tried to, my brothers would choose to fight over it rather than to talk, and I would always choose to talk, that sort of thing. I think I've always felt like there's probably been some pressure to try and, man up when looking at things like how certain things that happen in your life affect you emotionally and whatever else. So I suppose, yeah, just interesting how somebody, a man who perhaps has, questioned some of these dominant ideas about masculinity, and whether there's been some connection there with him then developing a more caring relationship with the environment. And perhaps vice versa, do some of our dominant ideas about masculinity stop men and boys from, or obstruct them from being able to develop those more caring relationships with the environment, I guess. So I do think that perhaps we could argue that the environmental movement in the UK in quite a few different ways brings into question some of these kind of patriarchal norms and expectations I've been talking about, and offers perhaps a different way of organizing society, I guess, including in quite gendered ways. So we do see like women, LGBTQ people often playing quite a decisive role in these movements, right, in leadership roles and things like that. Often they're organized in quite collective, horizontal ways as opposed to more hierarchical ways, and really prioritizing principles of non-violence. So yeah, perhaps challenging some of those dominant masculine norms I was talking about. But nonetheless, I'm not trying to create some rosy picture here, because of course we can see as well that there are some of these kind of gender stereotypes, like essentialist ideas about women and men and nature and the earth, and and gender inequalities persisting within the environmental movement as well. So yeah, I'm not saying these things just vanish necessarily within these social movements. And also another interesting thing which some of my participants talked about was how there's a kind of growing awareness of things like climate justice, right? And how climate change connects to social inequalities of the kind I've been discussing, but at the same time, still some challenges there, like putting that into their practice. Like we do see the environmental movement here in the UK still being quite white, middle class. So there are questions there about how to broaden the movement, and perhaps thinking about gender could be one way of helping to do that, I guess. And there's clearly a need there to be highlighting the kinds of gender inequalities I've been talking about. But just lastly, just for the last few minutes, I suppose another thing I'm interested in, or in terms of solutions, I guess, where can we go from here with all the stuff I've been discussing? I think that there's actually potentially a lot of lessons which can be learned from violence prevention work, and vice versa, efforts to our environmental activism and care for the environment, which could help us to address the climate crisis and violence simultaneously, right? I think there's a lot of interconnections there which are quite interesting and important. In terms of research on violence prevention, lots of evidence shows we need a kind of gender transformative approach, which kind of is bringing into question and addressing the kinds of restrictive gender norms I've been talking about, which can obstruct action and care for the environment. Lessons there from what we know from work to prevent violence and abuse, and actually potentially as well vice versa. I suppose there's some interesting research around how developing more caring relationships for the environment, or for non-human animals, in spaces like prison or in schools, how those can actually help to create shifts away from violence, actually, that building those more caring relationships can offer an antidote to violence potentially, including when it comes to nature and the environment. So I suppose, there's some interesting cross-fertilization which could perhaps go on here with eco-pedagogical approaches. So perhaps we could use more of these kinds of nature-based activities in violence prevention work as well, for example. And perhaps some of the common threads there are that it's really important, I guess, right, to foster skills which enable boys and men to kind of critically reflect on our identities and our behaviors, the impacts they have on other people, on our environment, how those are very much shaped and influenced by the society which we live in, and the kinds of ideas which we're learning all the time from wider society about things like masculinity, and how it's possible to actually shift these things in healthier directions for ourselves, for the people around us, for the environment. There's lots of research showing how nature connectedness actually has hugely positive impacts on our own health and well-being, right, as well as for the environment. I suppose perhaps we could think about how could we help men and boys to develop a kind of ethic of care with the environment, which means we're doing a better job of looking after the world around us, and that has these positive impacts on ourselves as well. Because fundamentally, I really do think that connection with other people, with other living things, and those kind of interdependent relationships really, I do think, are crucial to the solution of when it comes to preventing violence and abuse, right? It makes violence a less viable option, I think, if you've got those real connections with other living things, not just other people either. Yeah, but just lastly, to conclude, because I have been rambling for quite a while, I suppose just a few caveats as well, right? Like I think it's important to recognize, I'm not just like having a go at men here, right? Like we're all complicit in these problems. Of course we are. But at the same time, some of us are more complicit than others, right? There are big power dynamics going on here, not just in terms of gender, of course. Those of us living in the global north, living here in the UK, are contributing much more to climate change than people in other parts of the world. There are these huge inequalities among men, as I've said. And also, like, it's not just about individuals, right? Like, any kind of prevention work, whether that's violence or tackling climate change, we need change at every level of society, not just among individuals. We need to be addressing those broader cultures and social structures which are really perpetuating this. But nonetheless, I think that we men and boys can have a positive role to play here, right? We can be influential voices for change, and arguably we do have a responsibility to do that because of the disproportionate role that men as a group are playing in these problems, and that actually benefits all of us in the end. I do think that caring for the environment obviously it benefits the environment itself, but it also benefits us as humans ultimately, and yeah, it can potentially help also to get to the roots of a lot of the violence we see in society as well. So yeah, hopefully I've made those kind of interconnections clear. And I suppose, yeah, I'm just interested as well in, like, are things already shifting in this regard? Like, is climate change forcing some of us to reflect more on our relationships with the world around us, with other people, with gender and our gendered identities? Yeah, I suppose that's something, it's an open question, which hopefully my research will shed some light on. But yeah, I'll stop there. Just one last thing to highlight. I do run a podcast with a friend and colleague about all of the kinds of issues I've been discussing today. It's called Now and Men. Do check it out if you're interested. We just had a new episode come out today with Jackson Katz, who you may well have heard of, is quite a important voice in the kind of violence prevention field. But yeah, any questions or comments, very welcome. Thank you so much.